My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known as someone steady, dependable, the kind of woman people described with phrases like low drama or easy to live with. I worked, I showed up, I kept things moving, and from the outside, my marriage looked the same way, stable, quiet, intact. That appearance wasn't accidental, it was curated, maintained, protected. If you had asked our friends, our families, even our neighbors, they would have told you we were doing well. No public fights, no social media hints, no whispered concerns. We hosted dinners, we split responsibilities, we smiled in photographs. And because nothing looked broken, no one ever asked if anything was. What most people don't realize is that stability can exist alongside erosion. A relationship can remain peaceful while slowly collapsing. That damage doesn't always announce itself loudly. It often hides behind politeness, routine, and a person who's learned how to absorb discomfort without making it visible. That person was me. I wasn't underestimated because I was weak. I was underestimated because I was quiet, because I listened more than I spoke, because I didn't correct people when they misunderstood my role, my tolerance, or my limits. I let assumptions stand. I let silence do the work of keeping things calm. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There are no shocking twists, no screaming matches, no villains monologuing their cruelty. There's no revenge here, no score settling. What you're about to hear is a slow, honest account of how a marriage can look whole while quietly hollowing out, and what happens when the person holding it together stops doing that invisible labor. I'm telling this story now, not to rewrite the past, but to finally name it accurately. To talk about what it costs to keep the peace when peace only flows one way. To show how power can exist without volume, and how change doesn't always arrive with confrontation. It sometimes arrives as clarity. If you've ever felt like the most important work you were doing went unnoticed, if you've ever been praised for being easy while feeling increasingly erased, if you've ever wondered whether silence was protecting you or slowly shrinking you, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't dramatize pain that was already real. I'll tell you exactly how things unfolded, calmly, carefully, and truthfully. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever been praised for holding everything together while no one noticed what it was costing you? To them, I was the steady one. That was the word that followed me everywhere. Steady. At work, it meant I could be trusted with deadlines no one else wanted. In my family, it meant I was the one people called when something needed fixing, organizing, or smoothing over. And in my marriage, it meant I was the emotional infrastructure, the quiet system that made everything else run. No one ever said it out loud, but I felt it in the way conversations moved around me instead of toward me. I was the listener, not the center. The one who remembered birthdays, tracked expenses, and noticed moods before they became problems. If something went wrong, I handled it before it became visible. And because of that, very little ever looked wrong. I wasn't invisible in the sense of being ignored. I was visible in a functional way, useful, reliable, low maintenance. People saw me as someone who didn't need much, because I never asked for much. Not because I didn't have needs, but because I learned early that asking complicated things made others uncomfortable. In my marriage, this role fit seamlessly. My husband would often describe me to others as easy to live with. He meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. Easy meant I didn't argue over small things. Easy meant I adapted. Easy meant I didn't escalate. When decisions were made without me, I adjusted. When plans changed, I accommodated. When something bothered me, I weighed whether it was worth disrupting the calm, and usually decided it wasn't. From the outside, we looked balanced. He was more expressive, more opinionated. I was calmer, more grounded. People liked that contrast. They'd say things like, "You two balance each other out," or "She keeps him grounded." I smiled when they said it. I didn't correct them. What they didn't see was how often grounding meant absorbing. Absorbing dismissive comments disguised as jokes. Absorbing decisions already finalized before I was informed. Absorbing the subtle shift from partnership to expectation. None of it is dramatic enough to point to. None of it was loud enough to demand intervention. Just small, cumulative moments where my presence mattered less than my compliance. I told myself stories to make it reasonable. This is what compromise looks like. He's stressed. I'm just more adaptable. And because I said those things calmly, because I didn't cry or yell or threaten to leave, everyone assumed I was fine, including him. I became very good at being the emotional buffer. If tension entered a room, I diluted it. If someone was upset, I translated. I noticed patterns before anyone else did, and quietly adjusted myself to avoid conflict. Over time, people stopped seeing that effort altogether. It became the baseline, the expectation. And expectations are strange things. Once set, they're rarely acknowledged again. I don't say this with bitterness. I'm describing it the way you'd describe weather patterns, objectively, after the fact. At the time, I believed this role was a strength. I believed being low friction meant being mature, that keeping things smooth was a form of love. What I didn't realize yet was how thoroughly I had been categorized. I was the one who wouldn't make a scene, the one who wouldn't leave, the one who would understand. And when someone believes those things about you long enough, they stop checking whether they're still true. There's a specific loneliness that comes from being consistently relied upon, but rarely considered. From being known as capable instead of cared for. From being seen as stable instead of seen fully. I carried that loneliness quietly because it didn't seem like the kind of loneliness that justified complaint. After all, nothing was wrong, not in any obvious way. But something essential was missing, and at that stage, I couldn't yet name it. I only knew that the version of me everyone depended on felt thinner each year, more like a role than a person. And roles, once assigned, are hard to step out of without unsettling everyone who benefits from them. That was who I was to them. Not weak, not broken, just assumed. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the strange thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves as injuries. They feel more like misunderstandings. Moments you replay once or twice, then file away because bringing them up would feel disproportionate. This was one of those moments. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal, just wine, shared plates, casual conversation. Someone asked a question about a decision we'd recently made together, or at least I thought we had. Before I could answer, my husband spoke over me, not loudly, not aggressively, just decisively. He explained our choice, his version of it. I remember pausing, my glass halfway to my mouth, listening. There were details missing, nuances, my reasoning, my concerns, but no one noticed because his explanation was smooth, confident, complete enough to sound final. I could have corrected him. I could have added, actually, what we talked about was... But the moment passed quickly. Someone nodded. Another person changed the subject. The conversation moved on without me. I smiled. I always smiled. Later that night, I mentioned it gently. I framed it carefully, the way I'd learned to do. I said something like, "Hey, earlier when you were explaining that, I felt a bit left out. I just wanted to share my side too." He looked surprised, not defensive, confused, as if the idea hadn't even occurred to him that there was another side. "Oh," he said, "I didn't think it was a big deal." That sentence landed softly, but it stayed. Not a big deal. It wasn't said unkindly. It wasn't meant to dismiss me. But it did something subtle. It reclassified the moment as insignificant. And because I trusted his intention, I accepted that classification. I told myself I was being sensitive, that he hadn't meant anything by it, that it was one conversation, one evening, one harmless oversight. I didn't want to be the kind of person who dissected interactions to death. I didn't want to introduce tension where none was necessary. So I let it go. But something shifted, not outwardly, but internally. A small recalibration, a new awareness. I started noticing how often this happened in miniature ways. Not just speaking over me, but speaking for me. Answering questions directed at both of us, without checking whether I wanted to respond, making plans in front of others and assuming my agreement. Each instance was minor, easily explained away, and each time I told myself the same thing. This isn't worth making an issue of. The problem wasn't any single moment. It was the accumulation of moments that taught him something without either of us realizing it, that I would adjust quietly, that I would fill in the gaps privately, that I would absorb the discomfort so the surface stayed smooth. And everyone else followed that lead. Friends began directing logistical questions to him. Family members assumed he was the decision maker. Even when I was present, my role slowly shifted from participant to support. Not because anyone intended it, but because no one ever saw me push back. The cut was small enough that it didn't bleed. It didn't hurt in a way that demanded attention, but it marked something, a line crossed without acknowledgement, a precedent set without discussion. I didn't realize then that this was the beginning of a pattern, that by choosing peace in that moment, I was also choosing silence, and silence, once established, is easily mistaken for consent. Looking back, I don't blame myself for not reacting differently. I didn't have the language yet. I didn't understand that boundaries aren't only for dramatic violations, they're for small erasures too. I was still operating under the belief that being reasonable meant being accommodating. But that night planted a memory that wouldn't go away. Not because it was traumatic, but because it was clarifying in hindsight. It was the first time I felt myself becoming slightly less visible in my own life. And no one else noticed at all. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That's how normalization works. There's no clear before and after. Just a gradual shift in what you accept as normal, reasonable, expected. If someone had asked me then whether I felt disrespected in my marriage, I would have said no without hesitation. Disrespect felt like too strong a word. What I was experiencing felt subtle, inconvenient, easy to rationalize. So I did. When my opinions were skipped over in group conversations, I told myself he was just more confident speaking publicly. When plans were made without consulting me first, I assumed efficiency, not exclusion. When he summarized our relationship to others in a way that didn't quite match my experience, I reminded myself that people tell stories differently. Each explanation was plausible. Each one helped me stay calm. And each one trained me to override a small internal signal that said, "This doesn't feel right." I started pre-editing myself. Before speaking, I'd ask, "Is this necessary? Will this change anything? Is it worth the friction?" Most of the time, the answer was no. Not because my thoughts didn't matter, but because I had learned that voicing them wouldn't shift the outcome. So I conserved energy. I chose quiet. And over time, quiet became my default. What I didn't realize was how visible that choice was to everyone else. Silence sends a message, even when you don't intend it to. It tells people what they can get away with. It tells them where your boundaries are, or that you might not have any worth testing. The dismissals became easier, casual, almost affectionate in tone. He'd interrupt me mid-sentence and finish my thought incorrectly, then laugh when I corrected him. "You know what I mean," he'd say. Or he'd respond to something serious I said with, "You're overthinking it." Not sharply, not cruelly, just enough to close the topic. And I'd let it close. I told myself that marriages require flexibility, that not every thought needs airtime, that harmony matters more than precision. These weren't lies. I still believe those things to an extent, but I was applying them unilaterally. I was the only one flexing. Slowly, my role shifted from partner to stabilizer. I wasn't there to be engaged with. I was there to keep things from tipping. And because I was good at it, no one questioned the arrangement. The most disorienting part was how normal it felt. There was no sudden loss, no dramatic betrayal, just a slow dulling of my own presence. I stopped expecting curiosity. I stopped offering disagreement unless I was certain it would be received well. I became strategic about when to speak, not to be manipulative, but to avoid being dismissed. That's when I knew something was off. Not because of how he treated me, but because of how I had started treating myself. I had internalized the idea that my thoughts were optional, that my emotional responses were inconveniences to be managed privately, that being loved meant being low impact. And the more I adjusted, the more others adjusted around me, assuming I was fine, assuming I didn't mind, assuming I would always adapt. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from constantly translating your inner world into something palatable for others, then deciding it's not worth sharing at all. I carried that exhaustion quietly. I functioned well. I smiled. I showed up. But inside, something hardened. Not anger, not resentment. Something more neutral and more dangerous to the status quo. Detachment. I began observing instead of participating, noticing patterns instead of reacting to them. I paid attention to who was listened to, whose preferences shaped outcomes, and whose discomfort mattered enough to prompt change. And I noticed with uncomfortable clarity that mine rarely did. This wasn't about him becoming cruel. It was about me becoming predictable. He didn't need to dismiss me deliberately. I dismissed myself preemptively. I made it easy. That realization didn't make me want to fight. It made me want to understand, to see how we got here, to see what I had contributed to this dynamic by confusing peace with absence. I still didn't confront him, not yet. I was still too invested in being reasonable, in not making a thing out of something that had no single dramatic moment attached to it. But the normalization was complete. What once would have felt like a small cut now barely registered at all. And that scared me more than any argument ever could. It wasn't until much later that I understood this wasn't just a series of moments. It was a role. Roles form quietly. No one announces them. They emerge from repetition, from what you tolerate, from what you make easy for others. And once a role solidifies, people interact with the role instead of the person. Mine was simple. I was the reliable one, the one who would handle it, the one who wouldn't object, the one who would understand. I saw it in how decisions were discussed around me instead of with me. Conversations would move forward as if my agreement was assumed, not required. My presence became symbolic, proof that things were fine, rather than participatory. At first, I thought this was maturity. I told myself that not everything needs to be negotiated. Strong relationships don't require constant affirmation. But there's a difference between trust and erasure, and I had crossed that line without noticing. I began to see how others spoke to me, not unkindly, but conclusively, as if my input had already been factored in by default. When I did offer a differing opinion, there was often a pause, a recalibration, not resistance, confusion, as though I had momentarily stepped out of character. And nothing reveals a role more clearly than the discomfort people feel when you stop playing it. At home, the expectations were subtle but firm. I managed the invisible logistics. I remembered. I anticipated. I smoothed. When something went well, it was just how things were supposed to go. When something didn't, I felt an unspoken pressure to absorb the impact. Not because anyone demanded it, but because that's what I'd always done. What troubled me wasn't the imbalance itself. It was how normalized it had become, how little curiosity there was about my experience. No one asked whether I was tired of being the anchor, whether I wanted something different, whether the version of me they relied on still existed willingly. And I realized something unsettling. I had trained them well. I had rewarded assumptions with compliance. I had responded to dismissal with calm. I had treated my own discomfort as something to be managed internally, rather than addressed collectively. Over time, this taught everyone, including my husband, that my boundaries were flexible, negotiable, maybe even non-existent. But boundaries don't disappear. They go underground. I still had values. I still had limits. I just stopped expressing them out loud. And because no one could see them anymore, they stopped accounting for them. The role of reliable came with an unspoken cost, invisibility. Not total erasure, but a kind of emotional flattening. I was present but not fully engaged, included but not consulted, needed but not known. And the strangest part, I was praised for it. People would say things like, "You're so easygoing," or "I don't know how you stay so calm," or He's lucky to have someone like you. I accepted those compliments politely, even as something in me recoiled, because what they were really admiring was my willingness to disappear in small ways. I didn't resent them for it. They were responding to the version of me I had presented. But I began to feel a growing distance between who I was internally and who I was allowed to be externally. That distance became a quiet pressure. I noticed how often my husband spoke about our life using I instead of we, how decisions were framed as conclusions rather than conversations, how my agreement was implied, not invited. And still I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was watching. I wanted to understand the system I was in before I disrupted it. I wanted to see how deeply this role was embedded, whether it could be softened, renegotiated, or whether it had become structural. Because once a role becomes structural, stepping out of it doesn't cause friction, it causes collapse. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I was no longer unaware. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no revelation delivered in a moment of crisis. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the kind of silence that usually felt safe to me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, half working, half listening to the familiar rhythm of our life. He was talking about a plan he had made, not a future dream, not a casual idea, a concrete decision. Dates, logistics, and assumptions are already locked in. And as I listened, I realized something with surprising clarity. I had not been part of this decision at all. Not consulted, not informed beforehand, just placed into it. I remember the exact sensation, not anger, not sadness. It felt like a door closing very quietly inside me. A click. Clean, final. I asked a question, not confrontational, just factual. When did you decide this? He answered easily, casually, as if the timeline didn't matter, as if my presence in the process was optional, as if my role was simply to adapt, like always. And in that moment, I saw the pattern in full, not as a series of misunderstandings, not as stress, not as poor communication, but as a system that worked because I made it work. A system where my silence was not neutral, it was functional. What shifted wasn't my behavior, it was my interpretation. For the first time, I stopped asking, "Why is he doing this?" and started asking, "Why am I still allowing it?" That question didn't come with judgment. It came with calm, with a kind of emotional distance I hadn't felt before. I wasn't hurt in the way I used to be. I was clear. I didn't argue. I didn't object. I nodded, said I needed to think, and returned to my laptop. He continued his day, unaware that anything had changed. But something had. I realized then that confrontation wasn't my next move. Understanding was. I began replaying past moments, not to assign blame, but to trace cause and effect. How often I had chosen ease over expression. How often I had minimized myself to preserve stability. How that choice, repeated over the years, had taught everyone exactly how to treat me. This wasn't about him being malicious. It was about me being consistently accommodating. An accommodation, when unbalanced, becomes expectation. That afternoon, I didn't feel small. I felt grounded. Detached enough to see clearly, but present enough to care. I understood that if I spoke up now, I'd be treated like I was overreacting, like this was sudden, like this came out of nowhere. But it didn't. It had been building quietly for a long time. So instead of reacting, I observed. I paid attention to my own responses, noticing how little urge I felt to explain myself, how unnecessary it suddenly seemed to justify my need to be included, how tired I was of translating basic partnership into something digestible. I also noticed something else, something important. I wasn't afraid of losing the relationship anymore. That realization didn't bring relief or excitement. It brought neutrality, a sense that whatever happened next, I would be okay. That my identity wasn't as entangled in this dynamic as I once believed. I didn't share this shift with anyone, not friends, not family, not him. It wasn't something to be announced. It was something to be understood privately. That evening we ate dinner like we always did. We talked about small things. The tone was normal, comfortable. If someone had been watching us, they would have seen nothing unusual. But inside, I had stepped back, not emotionally withdrawn, but strategically present, no longer trying to maintain equilibrium at my own expense, no longer assuming it was my job to absorb. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to disappear quietly and call it peace. That day didn't end the marriage. It didn't start a plan. It started with clarity. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave. After that day, I didn't suddenly find my voice. That's the part people often misunderstand. Silence, when chosen consciously, isn't the same as silence born of fear. What changed wasn't my volume, it was my intent. I stopped explaining myself, not in a dramatic way. I didn't announce new boundaries or demand different treatment. I simply stopped offering emotional labor that went unrecognized. I answered questions directly instead of cushioning them. I listened without correcting. I observed without absorbing. And because I had been so consistently accommodating before, this shift went unnoticed. He assumed I was fine, everyone did. That's the paradox of being invisible for too long. When you finally step back, people assume you're still standing in the same place. My silence became deliberate, strategic. I used it to gather information rather than deflect tension. I paid attention to what happened when I didn't smooth things over. Who noticed? Who filled the gaps? Who didn't? Most people didn't. I realized how much effort I had been putting into maintaining emotional continuity, how often I had stepped in to clarify intentions, soften language, or preempt conflict. Without that buffer, small misunderstandings began to linger. Conversations ended abruptly. Decisions felt heavier. Still, no one connected those changes to me. They never do. When silence is mistaken for weakness, it gives you an unexpected advantage. Time, space, the ability to see without being seen. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, decisions, patterns. Not because I was preparing a case, but because I wanted accuracy. I wanted to trust my memory. I wanted to stop second-guessing myself. I also noticed how differently I felt. Lighter, in a way. Less reactive. Less invested in being understood. There's a strange freedom in letting go of the need to be validated by people who aren't listening anyway. My husband interpreted my quiet as contentment, as acceptance, as maturity. He became more decisive, more unilateral, mistaking my lack of objection for agreement. And I let him, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I was no longer trying to be heard. I was trying to see the full shape of the dynamic I was in, to understand what would happen if I stopped compensating. What happened was this: the imbalance became obvious. Without my constant adjustments, the relationship revealed itself as asymmetrical. He moved forward. I adapted, or rather, I stopped adapting. I let the friction exist. I didn't argue when decisions were made without me. I noted them. I didn't correct narratives that excluded my perspective. I listened to them as data. This wasn't passive aggression. There was no hidden agenda. I wasn't testing him. I was testing reality. Could this relationship function without my invisible labor? The answer came slowly but unmistakably. It functioned but poorly. There was more confusion, more misalignment, more moments of disconnection. But instead of prompting reflection, these issues were attributed to stress, timing, and external factors, never to the absence of my emotional scaffolding. And that told me everything I needed to know. If my presence was only noticeable when things fell apart, but never acknowledged when things ran smoothly, then my role wasn't partnership, it was maintenance. I didn't feel angry about this. I felt resolved. Silence gave me space to recenter, to ask myself hard questions without rushing to fix the answers, to consider what I wanted, not what would keep everyone comfortable. I began to imagine a life where my thoughts weren't pre-edited, where my presence didn't need to be minimized to be tolerated, where stability didn't require self-erasure. Those thoughts didn't scare me anymore. They felt possible. The silence continued, calm, intentional, unexplained, and everyone mistook it for compliance. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Silence creates space, and space creates perspective. While everyone else assumed nothing had changed, I was paying attention in a way I never had before, not emotionally, but structurally. I stopped asking how things felt and started asking how they worked. I watched how decisions were made, who initiated them, who benefited from them. I noticed how quickly my husband moved when he didn't expect resistance, how confidently he filled in blanks I no longer rushed to clarify. I saw how systems, financial, emotional, logistical, had been built around my quiet cooperation. And once you see systems, you can map them. I began organizing information, not out of paranoia, but out of self-respect. I reviewed shared accounts, contracts, and timelines. I read documents I'd previously trusted him to handle. I noticed patterns in spending, in planning, in how resources were allocated and justified. None of it was illegal, none of it is shocking, but it was revealing. I realized how much I had deferred, not because I was incapable, but because it was easier, because stepping in would have required asserting myself. And asserting myself had always come at the cost of peace. Now that peace was no longer my primary goal. I also started investing in myself quietly. Skills I'd postponed, knowledge I'd assumed I didn't need. I spoke with professionals, not dramatically, not urgently, just informational conversations, hypotheticals, explorations. What would this look like? What options exist? What should someone in my position understand? I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because it was secretive, but because it was mine. For the first time in a long while, my inner world wasn't open for consensus. The more I learned, the calmer I became. That surprised me. I had expected fear or sadness or grief. Instead, I felt grounded, prepared, as if I were finally standing on solid footing rather than constantly adjusting to shifting ground. Meanwhile, life continued as usual. We attended events, we made plans, we talked about the future in abstract terms. He remained confident, assured, certain that things were stable because they had always been. That's the danger of stability built on one person's silence. It looks permanent until it isn't. What he didn't notice was that I had stopped centering my decisions around his expectations. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was positioning. I paid attention to language, to what was said versus what was assumed. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies about my preferences, my availability, my priorities. I let people reveal what they believed about me. And they did. They believed I would stay. They believed I would adapt. They believed I would understand. Those beliefs made them comfortable. They also made them careless. I didn't confront that carelessness. I documented it. I also began reclaiming small pieces of myself. Time, energy, focus. I stopped overfunctioning. Stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine. Stopped cushioning outcomes that didn't involve me. And still no one noticed. Because when you've been invisible long enough, your absence feels like background noise, not a signal. This wasn't preparation in the dramatic sense. There were no countdowns, no secret deadlines, just a quiet alignment between what I knew and what I was no longer willing to tolerate. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't trying to win. I was preparing for autonomy. There's a difference. Autonomy doesn't require the other person to be wrong. It only requires you to stop being erased. By the time I finished gathering what I needed, information, clarity, confidence, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, not relief, readiness. And readiness is dangerous to systems that depend on your compliance. Still, I said nothing, because the most effective shifts happen long before anyone realizes a change is coming. The reveal didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I sat back and thought, this is it. No cinematic pause, no surge of triumph. What I felt instead was quiet confirmation, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place after you've already accepted what the picture will be. I was reviewing documents one evening, not anxiously, not obsessively, just methodically. By then, I had learned how to read between the lines I used to skim past. I knew what mattered and what didn't. I understood the structure well enough to see where the leverage lived. And I found it. Not a secret, not a scandal, not anything that would shock an outsider. Just asymmetry. I saw clearly, for the first time, how much of our shared life, rested on assumptions that only worked if I stayed silent and accommodating. How many decisions had been built on my implied consent rather than my explicit agreement? How much responsibility I carried without corresponding authority? And, more importantly, I saw where that could change. The realization didn't make me smile. It didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because clarity doesn't need emotion to be powerful. I understood then that I had options I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Not because they hadn't existed, but because considering them would have disrupted the image of stability I worked so hard to protect. Now that image mattered less than accuracy. I didn't act immediately. That's important. I didn't rush to use what I'd learned. I sat with it. I tested it mentally from every angle, not to find the most dramatic outcome, but the most ethical one. My moral code hadn't changed. I still didn't believe in retaliation. I didn't want to punish or humiliate or expose. I just wanted to stop participating in something that required my quiet disappearance. I asked myself difficult questions. If I act, am I doing this out of anger or alignment? If I leave things as they are, what am I consenting to long term? What does integrity look like now that I see the full picture? The answers came slowly but consistently. Integrity meant not pretending anymore. It meant not correcting the imbalance privately while presenting harmony publicly. It meant choosing truth over comfort, even if that truth unsettled others. What struck me most was how little resentment I felt. I had expected to feel wronged, vindicated, justified. Instead, I felt responsibility toward myself, toward the version of me that had been patient, understanding, and quiet for so long. She deserved accuracy. She deserved agency. I also realized something else, something sobering. If I revealed what I knew too early, it would be dismissed, framed as overthinking, emotionalized, turned into a discussion instead of a decision. So I kept it private. Leverage isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits until it's needed. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't hint at what I'd discovered. I didn't test reactions or seek reassurance. I simply adjusted internally, aligning my next steps with this new understanding. The peace in that decision surprised me. I slept better. I spoke less. I listened more selectively. My energy consolidated instead of leaking out through constant accommodation. Nothing had changed yet, but everything had. Because once you privately reclaim your power, you stop negotiating with yourself. And that's when the real decision begins to form. There comes a point, not dramatic, not loud, when possibility narrows into choice. For a long time, I lived in the space of maybe. Maybe things would rebalance. Maybe awareness would lead to change. Maybe this clarity was enough on its own. That space felt responsible, patient, open-ended. But clarity has a way of demanding direction. The decision point didn't arrive because something new happened. It arrived because nothing did. The pattern held. The assumptions remained intact. The role stayed assigned. And I realized that waiting was no longer neutral. It was a choice. I sat with the options carefully. I didn't rush to frame them as right or wrong. I wanted to see them plainly, without fear or fantasy. I could speak up fully now, lay everything out, name the imbalance, and ask for renegotiation. That path required vulnerability, patience, and the willingness to be misunderstood at first. It also required the other person to be capable of seeing me as something other than the role I'd always played. I could continue as I was, aware, detached, quietly autonomous in my mind, but still structurally bound to a system that depended on my invisibility. That option offered comfort and predictability, but it demanded a long-term trade I was no longer willing to make. Or I could choose something irreversible, not destructive, not explosive, just final in a way that didn't invite endless discussion. That option scared me, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. I noticed how my body responded to each possibility. The first came with tension, the second with heaviness, the third with a calm I didn't fully trust yet. Calm can be misleading when you're used to living in an accommodation, but this felt different. It wasn't numbness, it was alignment. I realized that any conversation I initiated now would be framed as a deviation, a disruption, a sudden change. Years of quiet had erased my credibility as someone who needed to be heard urgently, and I didn't want to debate my own existence anymore. This wasn't about blame. It was about the trajectory, about where things were heading if nothing changed, and whether I was willing to stay on that path simply because it was familiar. I thought about the future we casually referenced. How often was it described without my active input? How often was I included as an assumption rather than a collaborator? I imagined years more of that. Decades. That image clarified everything. The irreversible choice wasn't made in a single moment. It crystallized over several days of stillness. Mornings where I woke up clear instead of conflicted. Evenings where I felt settled rather than tense. I didn't announce it. I didn't write it down. I simply stopped weighing alternatives. Once that happened, the noise disappeared. I knew what I was going to do, not in detail yet, but in direction. And I knew something else too. If I hesitated now, I would betray the clarity I had worked so hard to earn. So I committed internally, to myself, to truth, to a future where my presence didn't require permission. The decision was made long before anyone else felt its effects. That's how most real decisions happen. Quietly, completely, and without witnesses. Once the decision was made, there was no urgency. That might sound strange, but urgency belongs to doubt. When you're still convincing yourself, everything feels rushed. When you're certain, you move deliberately. I didn't change the tone of our home. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance. I stayed calm, engaged, and observant. On the surface, nothing shifted. And because I had always been consistent, no one thought to question that consistency now. What changed was invisible. I began separating my actions from my explanations. I stopped narrating my inner process. I didn't announce intentions or seek agreement. I simply acted where action was required, quietly, cleanly, without spectacle. I handled practical matters one by one, methodically, no shortcuts. I didn't do anything that would cause alarm. I didn't move faster than necessary. I understood the value of timing, not as manipulation, but as respect for process. This phase wasn't emotional, it was logistical. I organized documents. I clarified ownership. I ensured that what was mine was clearly defined as such. I asked neutral questions when needed. I gathered information without signaling concern. I treated every step like preparation rather than escape. At times I was struck by how little resistance there was. Systems built on assumptions rarely defend themselves until the assumption is gone. I noticed how often my husband spoke about future plans with confidence. Plans that still included me, unquestioned. I listened without correcting him. Not because I was deceiving him, but because the conversation no longer required my participation. I wasn't misleading. I was no longer volunteering reassurance. There's a difference. I also became more selective with my energy. I stopped filling empty space with effort. If something wasn't asked of me directly, I didn't preemptively handle it. I let tasks remain undone until someone noticed. Some things were noticed, some weren't. And that distinction told me exactly how much of my labor had been taken for granted. I didn't feel resentful watching this. I felt validated. The quiet kind of validation that doesn't need applause. Just confirmation that your understanding of reality is accurate. I was careful not to act out of coldness. I remained polite, consistent, fair. I didn't want to rewrite myself as someone else to justify the change. I wanted continuity, with integrity. In moments of reflection, I checked in with myself. Am I still acting from alignment? Am I being honest in my behavior, even if I'm not explaining it? The answer was always yes. Silence, when grounded in certainty, is not avoidance, it's restraint. I knew that once this process reached its natural conclusion, explanations would be demanded. Questions would surface, reactions would follow. But explanations are most effective when they come after the ground has already shifted. Until then, my responsibility was simple. Move carefully, move cleanly, move without noise. And I did. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came the way most real consequences do, subtly, unevenly, and without explanation. At first, it was just a sense of friction. A few things are not lining up the way they used to. small disruptions that couldn't be traced back to a single cause. He noticed, but only vaguely. Something felt off. Not wrong, just different. Plans required more clarification. Tasks didn't resolve themselves as smoothly. Conversations ended without the usual sense of closure. The emotional continuity he was used to, something I had quietly maintained for years, was no longer automatic. And for the first time, he felt that absence. He didn't know what it was, he couldn't name it. He certainly didn't connect it to me. He assumed stress, timing, external pressure. That's what people assume when the foundation shifts, but the structure still looks intact. I watched this without satisfaction. That's important to say. There was no sense of finally, no vindication, just observation, the calm kind. The kind that comes when you've already accepted the outcome. I noticed how often he paused now, how he asked questions he'd never asked before. He seemed momentarily unsure in situations where confidence used to come easily. Not because I was doing anything to undermine him, but because I was no longer compensating. The invisible support had been removed, and gravity was doing what gravity does. At first, he tried to restore the familiar rhythm. He became more talkative, more expressive. He filled space with commentary, with plans, with reassurance. It wasn't manipulative, it was instinctive. He was reaching for equilibrium without understanding what had changed. But equilibrium requires participation from both sides. And I was no longer participating in the same way. I responded politely, calmly, without adding emotional texture. I didn't argue or accuse. I didn't point out what was missing. I let him feel it instead, not as punishment, but as information. Others noticed too eventually. Friends commented on the energy between us. Not directly, just small remarks. "You seem quieter lately." "Everything okay?" I answered honestly but briefly. "I'm fine," which was true. The difference was that I no longer felt responsible for managing other people's interpretations. What surprised me most was how unsettled everyone else became before I did. I was steady. I had already adjusted internally. I had already grieved the version of the relationship that required my silence. Everyone else was just beginning to sense the shift. He grew restless. Not angry, not confrontational, just uneasy, as if something he relied on was no longer reliable, but he couldn't identify what it was or why it mattered so much. That unease surfaced in small ways. Questions about plans we'd already discussed, checking in more frequently, seeking confirmation he'd never needed before, and I answered truthfully, but without filling in the gaps. I didn't reassure him unnecessarily. I didn't soothe the discomfort I hadn't caused. I allowed uncertainty to exist. For years, I had absorbed uncertainty on his behalf. Now it belonged where it originated. This was the beginning of the end. Not because something dramatic happened, but because the system was no longer being maintained. And systems that depend on unacknowledged labor collapse slowly, then all at once. He didn't know that yet, but he was starting to feel it. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. That's not meant to sound cruel. It's just how timing works when change has been delayed too long. Awareness that arrives late doesn't reverse damage, it only explains it. He started asking questions more directly then. Not accusations, not demands. Questions that came from confusion rather than understanding. "Are you upset about something? Did I miss something? You've been different lately." I heard the sincerity in his voice. I also heard the absence of context. These questions weren't invitations to renegotiate the past. They were attempts to restore the version of me that made everything feel stable. And that version was gone. I answered carefully. Honestly, but not expansively. I didn't list grievances. I didn't trace timelines. I didn't revisit moments that had already been processed internally and put to rest. I knew something important then. If I explained everything now, it would sound sudden, overwhelming, disproportionate. Years of quiet acceptance had erased the paper trail of my inner experience. So instead of trying to be understood, I focused on being accurate. "Yes," I said once, "something has changed for me." He looked relieved at first, as if naming it meant it could be fixed. He moved closer emotionally and began offering solutions. Conversations, adjustments, promises of doing better. And I listened. Not cynically, not dismissively. I listened with the clarity of someone who had already moved through the emotional work privately. I could see his effort for what it was, real, but reactive. He was responding to the loss of comfort, not the reality of who I had been becoming. That distinction mattered. Repair requires two people meeting in the present. What he was offering was an attempt to return to the past, to the version of the relationship where my silence filled in all the cracks. I wasn't angry that he wanted that. I understood it. It made sense. But understanding doesn't obligate reversal. There's a point in any long erosion where awareness becomes regret instead of change, where the desire to fix things is driven more by panic than by readiness to reconfigure the dynamic itself. He was ready to talk. I had already finished deciding. That asymmetry couldn't be bridged. I noticed how often his proposals still centered on adjustment rather than restructuring, on me expressing more, speaking up sooner, being clearer, without fully addressing why my silence had felt safer than my voice for so long. Not out of malice, out of habit. Habits don't dissolve on command, and I didn't have the energy or the desire to teach him how to see me from the beginning again. That phase was over. What surprised me most was how calm I remained. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel guilty. I felt settled, as if the internal noise that had followed me for years had finally gone quiet. He felt the opposite. There was urgency in his movements now, in his tone, in his questions. He wanted timelines, explanations, reassurance. He wanted to know whether this was fixable. I didn't give him false hope, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because clarity is kinder than prolonging confusion. I told him the truth, gently and directly, that this wasn't about a single issue or a recent shift, that it had been building quietly for a long time, that I no longer felt aligned with the structure of our relationship. I didn't accuse, I didn't blame, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The realization landed heavily. I could see it in his posture, in the way he sat back, suddenly unsure. This wasn't a problem he could solve with effort or intention alone. Some things can't be repaired because they weren't broken suddenly. They were worn down slowly, while everyone believed they were intact. By the time he understood that, it was already too late. The confrontation people imagined never really happened. There was no shouting, no dramatic reveal, no moment where everything spilled out at once. What did happen was quieter and far more final. We sat across from each other at the same table where so many everyday conversations had taken place. The lighting was ordinary, the timing unremarkable. If someone had walked past the window, they would have seen nothing worth noting. I spoke first, not because I needed control, but because clarity had already settled in me. I told him I had made a decision. I didn't frame it as an ultimatum. I didn't open with history. I didn't list grievances. I stated where I was and what I needed now. He listened in silence, real silence, not an interruption, not defense, just stillness. I could tell he was trying to understand how we'd arrived here without realizing it sooner. He asked a few questions, careful ones, not challenges, attempts to find footing. Why didn't you say something earlier? Was there a moment I missed? I answered honestly. I told him I had spoken, just not loudly, that I had expressed discomfort in ways that were easy to overlook, that I had trusted small corrections would be enough. Over time, I learned my voice didn't change outcomes, so I conserved it. I didn't say this with accusation, I said it as an explanation. He nodded slowly, could see the weight of recognition settling in, not just of what he'd done, but of what I had allowed. That mattered to me. I didn't want to cast him as the sole author of our ending. This wasn't about fault, it was about fit. We talked about who we had been to each other, about how roles had formed, about how comfort had replaced curiosity, about how easy it is to mistake silence for contentment. There were pauses, long ones, not uncomfortable, just heavy. He asked if there was anything he could do now. That was the hardest part, because the answer wasn't cruel, it was simple. No, I said, not in the way you're asking. I explained that the work required to rebuild trust and partnership would have needed to start years ago, when I still felt safe being visible, that I no longer had the capacity to reopen that chapter, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me. He just sat with it. That's when I knew the conversation was complete. There's a moment in calm confrontations when both people understand that words are no longer the bridge. Those decisions have already been made internally. All that's left is acknowledgement. We spoke practically after that. Logistics, timing, next steps. Not coldly, but respectfully. Like two people accepting the end of something they had both outgrown in different ways. When the conversation ended, I didn't feel empty. I felt intact. I had said what needed to be said, without raising my voice, without rewriting myself to be heard. I hadn't needed to inflict pain to justify clarity. That mattered, because for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was negotiating my own reality. I was simply stating it. After everything settled, after the conversations, the logistics, the quiet endings, people expected me to be different in obvious ways. Sad, angry, relieved. Some visible marker of transformation. But the truth is, I didn't feel transformed. I felt refreshed. For so long, my energy had been directed outward, monitoring, adjusting, absorbing. When that stopped, what remained wasn't emptiness, it was space. And in that space, I began to recognize myself again. Not as a role, not as a stabilizer, but as a person with edges, preferences, and presence. I didn't rush to redefine myself publicly. I didn't announce lessons learned or reinvent my identity overnight. I let the change integrate quietly, the way it had begun. What I noticed first was how differently I spoke. Not louder, not more forceful, just more precisely. I didn't soften statements to make them easier to receive. I didn't preemptively justify my needs. If something mattered to me, I said so. If it didn't, I let it go without explanation. That alone changed how people responded. Some were surprised, some needed time to recalibrate. A few drifted away, not angrily, just naturally, once the version of me they relied on was no longer available. I let them. Not everyone is meant to walk with you beyond the role they assign you. I also noticed how calm my inner world became. The low-grade tension I'd carried for years, always anticipating, always adjusting, was gone. Decisions felt simpler, not because life was easier, but because I wasn't negotiating against myself anymore. I trusted my own signals. If something felt off, I paid attention. If something felt aligned, I moved toward it without overanalyzing whether it would inconvenience someone else. That trust wasn't dramatic. It was steady, quiet, earned. I didn't regret the marriage. That surprises people when I say it. I don't see it as wasted time. It taught me how easy it is to confuse endurance with love, and how important it is to remain visible, even when visibility feels uncomfortable. Those lessons weren't theoretical. They lived. And because I lived them fully, I don't need to repeat them. What I carry forward now isn't bitterness. It's discernment. I know the difference between peace and silence, between compromise and erasure, between stability that nourishes and stability that drains. And I don't offer myself to situations that require me to shrink. That doesn't make me rigid. It makes me present. I still value calm. I still prefer resolution over drama. I just no longer believe that my quiet should come at the cost of my agency. Who I am now isn't louder. She's clearer. Clear about her boundaries. Clear about her values. Clear about the fact that being underestimated once doesn't mean it has to happen again. And if there's strength in that, it's not the kind that announces itself. It's the kind that stands without needing to prove anything. There's a lesson people often expect at the end of stories like this. Something sharp, something definitive, a warning or a rule or a clear villain to point to. But the truth I arrived at is quieter than that. Not all harm is loud. Not all loss comes from betrayal. And not all endings are caused by cruelty. Some relationships don't fail because someone did something unforgivable. They fail because one person slowly disappears and no one notices until they're gone. I stayed silent for a long time because I believed silence was kindness, because I thought understanding meant absorbing, because I thought being easy was a form of love. What I learned is this: peace that requires self-erasure is not peace. It's a postponement. If you're always the one adjusting, the one translating, the one making things smooth. Ask yourself a difficult question, not in anger, but in honesty. What happens if I stop? Who notices? Who asks why? Who assumes you'll return to your place? Those answers tell you more than any argument ever could. This story isn't about winning. It isn't about revenge or proving a point. It's about recognizing when a dynamic no longer allows you to be fully present and choosing integrity over comfort. Quiet people often carry the most responsibility in relationships. We're trusted to hold things together because we're good at it. But being capable doesn't mean being inexhaustible. And being calm doesn't mean being unaffected. If there's one thing I hope stays with you, it's this. Your voice doesn't need to be loud to matter, but it does need to be used. Not all at once, not dramatically, just honestly and in time. And if you're already at the point where silence feels safer than speaking, that's not a personal failure. It's information. Information you deserve to listen to. Before we end, I'd like to ask you something, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that you were keeping the peace while quietly losing yourself? If so, I'd love to hear what that moment looked like for you.